through the looking glass and what Alice found there. Chapter 7, The Lion and the Unicorn. The next moment, soldiers came running through the wood, at first in twos and threes, then 10 or 20 together, and at last in such crowds they seemed to fill the whole forest. Alice got behind a tree for fear of being run over and watched them go by. She thought that in all her life she'd never seen so many soldiers so uncertain on their feet. They were always tripping over something or each other, and whenever one went down, several more fell over him, so that the ground was soon covered in heaps of little men. Then came the horses. Having 4 feet, they managed to do rather better than the foot soldier, but even they stumbled now and then, and it seemed to be a regular rule that whenever a horse stumbled, the rider fell off instantly. The confusion got worse every moment, and Alice was glad to get out of the wood and into an open space, when she found the White King sitting on the ground, busily writing in his memorandum book. "I've sent them all," the king cried, in a tone of delight, on seeing Alice. "Did you happen to meet any soldiers, my dear, as you came through the wood?" "Yes, I did," said Alice. "Several thousand, I should think." 4,207. That's the exact number, the king said, referring to his book. "I couldn't send all the horses, because 2 of them are wanted in the game. And I haven't sent the 2 messengers either. They both have gone into town. Just look around the road and tell me if you can see either of them." "I can see nobody on the road," said Alice. "I only wish I had such eyes," the king remarked in a fretful tone. "To be able to see nobody, and at such a distance, too. Why, it's as much as I can do to see real people by this light." All this was lost on Alice, who was still looking intently along the road, shading her eyes with one hand. "I see somebody now," she exclaimed at last, "but he's coming very slowly, and what curious attitudes he goes into!" For the messenger kept skipping up and down and wriggling like an eel as he came along, with his great hands spread out like fans on each side. "Not at all," said the king. "He's an Anglo-Saxon messenger, and those are Anglo-Saxon attitudes. He only does them when he's happy. His name is Haya." He pronounced it to rhyme with mayor. I love I love my love with an H," Alice couldn't help beginning, "because he is happy. I hate him with an H because he is hideous. I fed him with ham sandwiches and hay. His name is Hea, and he lives on a hill," the king remarked simply, without the least idea that he was joining in the game, while Alice was still hesitating with the name of a town beginning with H. "The messengers called Hatta. I must have 2, and to come and go. One to come and the other to go." "I beg your pardon," said Alice. "It isn't respectable to beg. I only meant I didn't understand. Why do you have one to come and one to go?" "Don't I tell you?" repeated the king impatiently. "I must have 2, to fetch and to carry. One to fetch and one to carry." And at this moment the messenger arrived. He was far too out of breath to say a word, and could only wave his hands about and make fearful faces at the poor king. "This young lady loves you with an H," the king said, introducing Alice, in hope of turning off the messenger's attention from himself. But it was no use. The Anglo-Saxon's attitude only got more extraordinary with every moment, and the great eyes rolled wildly from side to side. "You alarm me," said the king. "I feel faint. Give me a ham sandwich." On which the messenger, to Alice's great amusement, opened a bag that hung round his neck, and handed a sandwich to the king, who devoured it greedily. "Another sandwich," said the king. "There's nothing left but hay now," said the messenger, peeping into his bag. "Hay, then," the king murmured in a faint whisper. Alice was glad to see it had revived him a great deal. "There's nothing like eating hay when you're faint," he remarked to her as he munched away. "I should think throwing cold water over you would be better, or some sort of salve au teal." "I didn't say there was nothing better," the king replied. "I said there was nothing like it," which Alice did not venture to deny. "Who did you pass on the road?" the king said, holding out his hand to the messenger for some more hay. "Nobody," said the messenger. "Quite right," the king said. "This young lady saw him too. Of course nobody walks slower than you." "I do my best," the messenger said in a sullen tone. "I'm sure nobody walks much faster than I can do." "He can't do that," said the king, "or else he'd have been here first. However, now you've got your breath, you may tell us what has happened in the town." "I'll whisper it," said the messenger, putting his hands to his mouth in the shape of a trumpet, and stooping so as to get close to the king's ear. Alice was sorry for this. She wanted to hear the news too. However, instead of whisper. He simply shouted at the top of his voice, "They're at it again!" "Do you call that a whisper?" cried the poor king, jumping up and shaking himself. "If you do such a thing again, I'll have you buttered." And it went through and through my head like an earthquake. It would have to be a very tiny earthquake, thought Alice. "Who are at it again?" And she ventured to ask. "Why, the lion and the unicorn, of course," said the king, "fighting for the crown." "Yes, to be sure," said the king. "And the best joke is, it's my own crown all the while. Let's run and see them." And they trotted off. Alice repeating to herself, she ran the words of the old song. The lion and the unicorn were fighting for the crown. The lion beat the unicorn all around the town. Some gave them white bread, and some gave brown, and some gave them plum cake, and drummed them out of town. "Does the one that this one wins, get the crown?" she asked, as well as she could, for she was run and putting herself quite out of breath. "Oh, dear me, no," said the king. "What an idea!" Would you would you be good enough?" Alice panted out after running a little further, "to stop a minute, just to get to one's breath again?" "Oh, I'm good enough," said the king. "Only I'm not strong enough. You see, a minute goes by so fearfully quick. You might as well try to stop a bandersnatch." Alice had no more breath for talking, so they trotted on in silence till they came to the sight of a great crowd, in the middle of which the lion and the unicorn were fighting. Were in such a cloud of dust that at first Alice could not make out which was which, but she soon managed to distinguish the unicorn by his horn. They placed themselves close together where the Hatter and the other messenger were standing watching together the fight, with a cup of tea in one hand and a piece of bread and butter in the other. "He's only just out of prison, and he hadn't finished his tea when he was sent in," Haya whispered to Alice. "They only gave him the oyster shells in there, and you see he's very hungry and thirsty. How are you, dear child?" he went on, putting his arm affectionately around Hatta's neck. Hatta looked around and nodded, and went on with his bread and butter. "Were you happy in prison, dear child?" Haya said. Hatta looked around once more, and this time a tear or two trickled down his cheek, but not a word would he say. "Speak, can't you?" Haya cried impatiently, but Hatta only munched away and drank some more tea. "Speak, won't you?" cried the king. "How are they getting on with the fight?" Hatta made a desperate effort and swallowed a large piece of bread and butter. "They're getting on very well," he said in a choking voice. "Each of them is about 87 times." "Then I suppose you'll soon bring the white bread and the brown," Alice ventured to remark. "It's waiting for 'em now," said Hatta. "This has been a bit of it as I'm eating." There was a pause in the fight just then, and the lion and the unicorn sat down, panting, while the king called out, "10 minutes allowed for refreshments." Haya and Hatta set to work at once, carrying round trays of white and brown bread. Alice took a piece to taste, but it was very dry. "I don't think they'll fight any more today," the king said to Hatta. "Go and order the drums to begin." And Hatta went bounding away like a grasshopper. For a minute or two Alice stood silent, watching them. Suddenly she brightened up. "Look, look!" she cried, pointing eagerly. "There's the White Queen running across the country. She's flying out of the wood over yonder. How fast those queens can run!" "There's some enemy after them, no doubt," the king said, without even looking round. "The wood's full of them." "But aren't you going to run and help her?" Alice asked, very much surprised at taking it so quietly. "No use, no use," said the king. "She runs so fearfully quick. You might as well try to catch a bandersnatch. But I'll make a memorandum about her, if you like. She's a dear good creature," he repeated softly to himself as he opened his memorandum book. "Do you spell creature with an E or a double E?" And at that moment the unicorn sauntered to them with his hands in his pockets. "I had the best of this time," he said to the king, just glancing at him as he passed. A little," the king replied, rather nervously. "You shouldn't have run him through with your horn, you know." "Ugh, it didn't hurt him," the unicorn said carelessly. He was going on when his eye happened to fall upon Alice, and he turned round instantly and stood there for some time looking at her with an air of the deepest disgust. "What is this?" he said at last. "This is a child," Hea replied eagerly, coming in front of Alice to introduce her, and spreading out his hands toward her in an Anglo-Saxon attitude. "We only found it today. It's as large as life and twice as natural." "I always thought they were fabulous monsters," said the unicorn. "Is it alive?" It can talk, Hea said solemnly. The unicorn looked dreamily at Alice and said, "Talk, child." Alice could not help her lips curling into a smile as she began. "Do you know, I always thought unicorns were fabulous monsters too? I've never seen one alive before." "Well, now that we have seen each other," said the unicorn, "if you'll believe in me, I'll believe in you. Is that a bargain?" "Yes, it is, if you like," said Alice. "Come and fetch out the plum cake, old man," the unicorn went on, turning from her to the king. "None of your brown bread for me." "Certainly, certainly," the king muttered, and beckoned to Hea. "Open the bag," and full he whispered, "Quick, not that one, that's full of hay." Hea took a large cake out of the bag and gave it to Alice to hold, while he got out a dish and a carving knife. And how it was that they came out of it, Alice could not guess. It was just like a conjuring trick, Alice thought. The lion had joined them a while he was going on. He looked very tired and sleepy, and his eyes were half shut. "What's this?" he said, blinking and lazily at Alice and speaking in a deep, hollow tone that sounded like a great tolling bell. "Ah, what is it now?" the unicorn cried eagerly. "You'll never guess. I couldn't." The lion looked wearily at Alice. "Are you an animal or a vegetable or a mineral?" he said, yawning at every word. "It's a fabulous monster," the unicorn cried out before Alice could reply. "Then hand round the plum cake, monster," the lion said, lying down and putting his chin on the paws. "And sit down, both of you," to the king and the unicorn. "Fair play with cake, you know." The king was evidently very uncomfortable with having to sit down between two great creatures, but there was no other place for him. "What a fight we might have for the crown now," the unicorn said, looking slyly up at the crown, which the poor king was nearly shaking off his head as he trembled so much. "I should win easy," said the lion. "I'm not so sure about that," said the unicorn. "Why, I beat you all around the town, you know, you chicken," the lion replied angrily, half getting up as he spoke. Here the king interrupted to prevent the quarrel going on. He was very nervous, and his voice quivered. "All around the town," he said. That's that's a good long way. Did you go by the old bridge or by the marketplace?" "You get the best view by the old bridge." "I'm not sure, I don't know," the lion growled out as he lay down again. There was too much dust to see anything, and by that time the monster was cutting up the cake. Alice had seated herself on the bank of a little brook, and with a great dish on her knees, and was sawing away very diligently with the knife. "It's very provoking," she said in reply to the lion, but she was quite getting used to being called the monster. "I've cut several slices of it already, but they're always joined on again." "You don't know how to manage looking-glass cakes," the unicorn remarked. "Hand it round first, then cut afterwards." This sounded like nonsense, but Alice very obediently got up and carried the dish round, and the cake divided itself into 3 pieces as she did so. "Now cut it up," said the lion as she returned to the place with the empty dish. "I say, this isn't fair," cried the unicorn, as Alice sat with the knife in her hand, very much puzzled how to begin. "The monster has given the lion twice as much as me." "She's kept none for herself, anyhow," said the lion. "Do you like plum cake, monster?" But before Alice could answer him, the drums began, and where the noise came from she couldn't make out. The air seemed full of it, and rang through her head till she felt quite deafened, and she started to look at her feet, and sprang across the little brook in terror, and just in time to see the lion and the unicorn rise to their feet with angry looks at being interrupted in their feast before she dropped to her knees and put her hands over her ears, vainly trying to shut out the dreadful uproar. "If that doesn't drum them out of town," she thought to herself, "nothing ever will."